This presentation is about the government's new Green Public Procurement Strategy and Action Plan. Green Public Procurement is coming. The background is the programme for government promised that all procurement contracts would include green public procurement criteria this year. And the background for such a commitment is the Climate Action Plan. Ireland has significant legally based targets to achieve in relation to greenhouse gas emissions. We're moving to minus 51% by 2030 and net zero by 2050. In addition to emissions, the public sector is to cut its energy efficiency or improve its energy efficiency by 50% by 2030. Part of the mix is the current Green Public Procurement Strategy. But also, which is very important in this context, is a commitment that the circular economy strategy will also apply, and the GPP document explains how this will be done. The plan was published on the 4th of April. It applies immediately in the sense that central purchasing bodies and public bodies with immediate effect have to include GPP criteria in all contracts over the EU value threshold. And for departments, GPP criteria apply for all contracts over 50,000 for supplies and services and over 200,000 for works. And from next year, all public bodies will include GPP criteria in their tenders over 50,000 for supplies and services and over 200,000 for works. And also from next year, and this is very important, contracting authorities are now asked to look at their corporate procurement plans and include a section on green or sustainable procurement, having regard to the recommendations and actions in the GPP strategy. And a very high demand is going to be placed on public bodies with a turnover in excess of, or revenue or expenditure in excess of 200 million. And they're going to be asked to deliver sustainable procurement in line with the international standard ISO 2400/2017. The GPP strategy and action plan will transform public procurement. It is based on climate action mandates that every public body is working on, including local authorities, the school sector, and the commercial semi-states that have their own arrangements. The strategy sets out 54 actions that will apply across the whole of government. There are 12 sectoral targets. It's requiring all tenders to apply a minimum environmental criteria, which I'll come to in a minute. It will require more monitoring and more reporting. It also, importantly, will apply the circular economy policies and principles into procurement for the first time. And it covers the commercial semi-state sector. Now, there are some caveats. In setting a tender, it is absolutely essential that if you're using GPP, it must be contract specific. You cannot use generic terms. This is especially important for the procurement of professional advisors. The criteria must be verifiable, they must be justifiable, and they should be proportionate. Now, that said, in my experience, an awful lot of Irish tenderers cannot and are not yet positioned to meet these higher environmental standards. The very reason for this is that green public procurement, sustainable procurement, is relatively new in Ireland. Another caveat is that the programme for government stated very clearly that green public procurement would be mandatory for all tenders. That is actually not the case. The document, if you read it, is more persuasive than mandatory. It sets a pathway for public bodies to begin the process of systematically including sustainable criteria in their tender documents. Some elements of the strategy won't apply until late next year or indeed later. And the issue of broader sustainability is referenced in the document but doesn't apply. Sustainability is wider than just green public procurement. So guidance is promised, as indeed it is in relation to using social considerations in procurement. That's out of scope of this document. And green public procurement will not apply to any public contracts for supplies and services lower than 50,000 or for small works contracts. And indeed it won't apply where there are no EU or national guidelines to hand, apart from the minimum environmental factors that I've mentioned. So how will a public body get started with GPP? Well, it applies throughout the entire procurement cycle. So when you're considering a tender, in the first instance, from a blank sheet of paper, you need to prepare a business case, and you need now to include GPP criteria, the technical specifications and requirements in your business case, and in turn into the tender documents. This may require you to engage with the market, because the market may or may not be mature enough to respond if you set very high environmental or sustainable standards. You need to set selection and award criteria based on the guidance that the Environmental Protection Agency and as set out in this strategy document. They should also be risk-based. And when you get the tenders in, you have the option of setting a weighting of up to 10% for GPP. That's a very high percentage. Also, when it comes to contract fulfillment, you will be asking the supplier to measure and monitor and report to you on the carbon savings or the energy efficiency savings, or the circular economy target achievements that they promised. The strategy document sets out a couple of GPP principles that all public bodies should be aware of. The first is to avoid unnecessary purchases. So when you're considering your business case and you want to procure, say, 100 computers, do you need 100 computers? Could you get away with 50? Could you repair or reuse some old computers? Or could you postpone the purchase if it's not absolutely necessary? So what this needs assessment is about is only procuring what's absolutely necessary and not to be procuring material that is not essential. So the way this would be done is to set guidance based on the EPA general guidance and based on the GPP strategy and from other sources, and to include minimum environmental criteria, which I'll come to now in a minute. You should also be aware that when it happens, which it will by the end of this year, all public bodies will be required to report whether they're using GPP or not. And if they do not use GPP in tendering documents, you'll have to explain why, to justify why you're not using this default requirement. The GPP strategy and action plan sets out 12 targets for different sectors. So if you have a tender in the area of the built environment, it is a requirement from next year that a minimum proportion of construction materials must use recycled materials. And for food and food waste, there are specific requirements in relation to certified organic food, addressing food waste, and disposable cups, plates, and cutlery. So if you have a tender in relation to food and food waste, you must use these product targets. The same with ICT equipment. You must procure products with an EPEAT gold standard or equivalent. And the same with textiles. There's a minimum standard. And for paper and printing, from this year, basically office paper and printing and photocopier must be procured and 100% must be recyclable. Same with energy products, same with indoor cleaning services and road transport. You have to make sure that any procurements that you're putting out in relation to these sectors comply with these products or sector targets. For example, again, in relation to road transport, all tenders must procure zero emission vehicles. There are some exceptions, but the default position is all future tenders for transport must be for zero emission vehicles. I mentioned earlier on the minimum environmental criteria. There's a menu and you can pick as appropriate and as contract specific. It would be very reasonable, for example, to request tenders to give recent and comparable reference sites for contracts where environmental measures or sustainable measures were delivered. It would be also reasonable to request tenders to describe the environmental impacts of the goods or services that they're going to supply to you. It would also be reasonable to ask tenderers what the carbon footprint of the goods being supplied to you are, or their business if they're delivering a service. You might also ask tenders to include training for their staff where it's important for contract fulfillment. And one minimum environmental criteria will, I think, become a mandatory one, is that you will need to ask tenderers for metrics so that you can monitor and measure and report during contract fulfillment. Practically all public bodies are now going to have to report on the impacts of GPP in their annual reports. The Environmental Protection Agency has excellent guidance on green public procurement. It dates from September 2021, but it will have to be updated, and this is recognised in the GPP strategy and action plan. It will also have to be changed having regard to estimate, forecast, deeper and OGP guidance, which is in the pipeline. The EPA is looking for stakeholder inputs, which is great. And they've also signalled that they're going to expand the current sector coverage to include furniture, buildings, paints, varnishes, and road markings. Importantly, the EPA's GPP guidance also applies to the commercial semi-state sector covered by the Utilities Directive. Public bodies will be familiar with these priority sectors: transport, ICT, food, cleaning, office buildings, lighting, heating, energy, paper, and textiles. These are the current sectors where very detailed guidance already exists. Another dimension of the GPP strategy is the use of life cycle costs. And essentially, these are essential when looking at a business case or where a long-term time product is being procured. Now, it's not suitable in all situations, but the guidance is, GPP strategy guidance is that life cycle costing must be used in works contracts over the EU value threshold in compliance with the EN standard 15978. Now, any public body who is looking to life cycle costs should Google the European Commission's LCC tools website, and there are sector-specific guidance and user guides available. Another dimension is verifying GPP, and it would be very reasonable for public bodies to require that products have eco labels. There are nearly 80,000 eco labels. So you may ask tenderers to declare that they have eco labels, but then you need to verify subsequently that they meet the requirements and specifications. It would also be reasonable to request tenderers, depending on the risk and proportion of the contract and its complexity, to have certain ISO standards, such as 14001, which is the Environmental Management System standard. And if you're procuring construction products in particular, you could require tenders to have compliance with the Environmental Product Declarations regulations. A new dimension to GPP is the requirement to report and obviously then to monitor performance of the contract. DEC will legislate to make reporting mandatory for public bodies. In addition, under the new e-tenders platform, the Office of Government Procurement is capturing data on green public procurement on the new e-forms and have promised guidance to contracting authorities about this. All public bodies, currently the requirement only applies to departments, will have to report on the use of GPP criteria, having regard to the EPA guidance document which is on the screen. And the comply or justify rule will apply from next year and obviously will be captured in annual reports at department level by the EPA and by the Office of Government Procurement. So let's talk a little bit about applying GPP. Very helpfully, the Office of Government Procurement has what's called a reference guide. It's fairly recent, it's available on their website, and it lists all prevalent EU and national guidance, and very helpfully includes hyperlinks to the relevant source documents. So if you're running a tender, say for ICT equipment, go into this document, check the section on ICT, go in live, see what hyperlinks exist, cut and paste the relevant technical specifications into your documents, or indeed use these to inform your business case. There are also useful case histories broken down by sector. These are very, very valuable when it comes to verifying how GPP might work in practice. If you can see how another country has managed it, that gives you a degree of assurance. Now, the document will obviously need to be updated, and the promise is that the OGP will update the document in the light of feedback it gets from you, the public sector, and having regard to developments at EU level. Also very helpful is the OGP's GPP criteria search website. So essentially, if you're running a food and catering service, you type in food and catering, technical specifications, and the relevant technical specifications or selection criteria or award criteria or contract performance clauses will appear, and you could then cut and paste them into your tender documents. This is a very useful website which will be updated obviously on an ongoing basis, not least because there will be new sectors added in the coming years. The government has a Circular Economy Act and a Circular Economy Strategy. It has a Waste Action Plan for the circular economy. There is a revised plan in play, and when it comes into play, targets will be set, new targets for compliance in relation to food, municipal and domestic waste, packaging, construction and demolition waste, plastics and textiles. So if you're procuring any of these sectors, you should await the EPA guidance, which is promised on foot of the forthcoming Circular Economy Strategy. The GPP strategy document goes into quite some detail about construction works. Won't obviously cover all of the issues in this presentation. I would reference the Irish Green Building Council's guidance document, which is extremely helpful and a good source document. But what the GPP strategy is recommending is that your tenders should set out in the specifications and requirements the environmental, energy and climate impacts, and these should be included in the preliminary project brief. You should also, where appropriate, reference the Energy Performance of Buildings Directive and the implementing regulations. There's an EPA best practice guidance on construction and demolition waste, which should be referenced in tender documents. You should also, if you're procuring retrofitting or procuring retrofitting through a one-stop shop, and this is a 25 billion euro market, you should require that the GPP criteria for works apply to retrofitting works. There is new guidance forthcoming at EU level for buildings. This is expected later this year, and once adopted, it should be included in your GPP criteria. There are sector targets. There are existing standards for steel, for timber, and there are standards promised for low carbon cement, which will be published during the course of the year. And once published, they too should appear in the technical specification for works contracts. And as I mentioned earlier, the revised circular economy strategy will set targets for the use of recycled materials, recycled construction materials. If you're involved with works, there's limited guidance in Ireland at the moment, but at EU level, what the GPP strategy is saying is you should look and see whether the guidance at EU level is relevant to what you're trying to procure, including road design, construction and road maintenance, road transport, road lighting, traffic signals, public space maintenance, and wastewater. And some of these guidelines at EU level are in fact being revised. Part of the strategy is that public bodies must include selection criteria, green public procurement selection criteria. And here is a menu of possible issues that you might want to put into your tenders. You might request 2 recent and comparable references where environmental and sustainable considerations were used, either in the public sector context or in a private sector context. You might look for the CVs to demonstrate the key environmental expertise of the team that's delivering whatever you're seeking to procure. You might wish to get samples of sustainable products, particularly those that have a required eco label. You may wish to set ISO standards for environment or energy management, and indeed request third-party conformity certificates. Very importantly, and this is a fairly significant change, it is now a requirement for public bodies, initially for the above EU thresholds, to set a minimum weighting in the award criteria for all tenders. A 5% minimum is recommended. However, the GPP strategy suggests this could go to 10% or even higher if your business case demonstrates that there could be a significant greenhouse gas emission saving, energy efficiency saving, or it could help achieve a circular economy target. So you have a degree of discretion between 5 and 10% or higher as to how you wish to put a weighting on the award criteria for GPP. The document doesn't recommend a form of words for an award criteria for GPP, but I've come up with this sort of template that you might wish to tweak depending on your own requirements, essentially saying tenderers must demonstrate how their proposed, be it service, supplies or works contract, will comply with the sustainability requirements set out in your technical specifications and the minimum environmental requirements, and to demonstrate how these processes will be embedded in their proposed approach and solutions that they're offering to you. And you should also look for measurable environmental impacts. You need metrics to comply with the reporting requirements. So get your tenderers to measure their impacts as part of the award criteria. The document, the GPP strategy, is a start. It is a pathway where sustainable procurement is going to become commonplace in the next few short years ahead of us. So it is not complete. There are a few gaps. For example, enabling legislation for mandatory reporting is under consideration. The current circular that covers green public procurement 2019 will have to be changed quite fundamentally, and this is promised later this year. The Office of Government Procurement will have to change their template requests for tenders. They'll have to change their contracts for services and supplies, and indeed the general guidance document, which was published only last October, again to reflect what's in the GPP strategy. The revised circular economy strategy, and as published, will set targets which will be eagerly awaited by those 6 subsectors. The construction works management framework will have to be fundamentally changed because the green GPP strategy document makes significant recommendations for change in relation to works contracts. And this is promised by the end of next year. We've also been promised guidance on sustainable public procurement as generally defined. And indeed, there will be revised EPA guidance, including new sectors. So quite an amount is in the pipeline, and we can anticipate that green public procurement is going to be on our agenda, very much front of our agenda for the foreseeable future. Public bodies have a lot to absorb. There are 54 actions. They're set out in Appendix 1 of the Green Public Procurement Strategy document. I think everyone's initial focus will be on embedding GPP criteria in the above EU threshold contracts. That will obviously be based on a needs assessment and embed it in your business case. You're also going to have to start work on adapting your corporate procurement plans to ensure that GPP is part and parcel of the corporate procurement plan, and also how, in putting GPP into your corporate procurement plan, you're going to actually support the delivery of your climate action mandate. So the two are linked. You might also, as a public body, wish to start preparing technical templates or specifications that embed sustainability for the procurement categories that are priority for you. You're also going to have to consider the correct weighting for green public procurement between 5 and 10%, and perhaps in your corporate procurement plan, give guidance as to whether it should be 5 or 10 or something in between. You're also going to have to consider how, primarily through drafting technical specifications, tenders should give you data that will allow you to measure the impacts of what they're supplying to you, giving you by way of a service solution. At the end of the year, GPP will apply from next year to all tenders over 50,000 for supplies and services. So in short order, the requirements are going to cascade down to a lower value of tender. You will also should be mindful that you will need to start capturing data on tenders awarded to social enterprises where GPP criteria were applied, because from next year, this will be part and parcel of your annual reporting. And whatever you do, keep up to date and use the OGP's criteria search engine and the reference document, which is, as I said, very helpful with all those hyperlinks. From next year, the gold standard for public bodies with a budget over 200 million is to acquire the gold standard for sustainable procurement, ISO 2400. Essentially, you will have to demonstrate that sustainable procurement is happening in your organization with reference to this standard. So a few concluding remarks. Yes, this is another layer of complexity. However, it's a necessary layer of complexity. Ireland has legally binding targets to reduce our greenhouse gas emissions and to improve our energy efficiency. They're set out in the Climate Action Plan, and GPP is a policy instrument that will help the public bodies achieve these targets. It is a necessary complexity. The strategy, thankfully, is primarily persuasive. It's not going down the mandatory route, which would require primary legislation, apart from perhaps reporting requirements, and it's encouraging all contracting authorities to take green public procurement, sustainable procurement on board, and to embed it into your procurement practices. Now, this is not going to happen unless there is investment in communications and investment in training, and not just to the public sector. The private sector, the tenderers, also need to be moving at the same pace as the public sector. And if they're not, the public sector may end up being very disappointed that Ireland's suppliers and tenderers can't meet the high standards of environmental sustainability because they're not being brought along as part of this process. That concludes. I hope you found the presentation useful, and if you have any questions or queries, you know where to contact me.